let's consider the computations for which you will be responsible for on test number 2. From Module 3, you will be provided a set of financial data listed in random order for an individual. We can call him Bill. The first thing you will have to determine from this random list of financial data is how rich this guy is. Now, the way you would do that, of course, is by adding up his assets, subtracting from that his liabilities in order to determine how rich he is. However, the trick here is to be able to distinguish assets from income and liabilities from expenses. Not always as easy as it may seem. But in Module 3, there is a set of lecture notes entitled, Is Income an Asset? Is Rent a Liability? Make sure you read that so that you can easily distinguish between those terms. The second thing you'll be responsible for is to determine what was Bill's gain or loss. You would do that, of course, by adding up all of his sources of income, subtracting the sum of his expenses. Again, the key here is not the arithmetic, that's easy enough. The key is to distinguish assets from income, liabilities from expenses. You will also have to determine how liquid this individual is. Now, the liquidity ratio is explained on page 77. If the liquidity ratio falls somewhere between 3 to 6 months of expenses, then the individual is sufficiently liquid. If the liquidity ratio is less than 3, the individual is not liquid enough. If the liquidity ratio is greater than 6, the individual is too liquid. Also on page 77 is the total asset to total debt ratio, and this will indicate how solvent an individual is. If this ratio is greater or equal to 1, the individual is solvent. If it is less than 1, the individual is insolvent. Now let me go back here to the liquidity ratio for just a second. I will tell you this on the test, but I'll say it here now, that for purposes of computing the liquidity ratio, a certificate of deposit, a CD, will be considered too illiquid to be included in the liquidity ratio. Let me also say that there are some practice exercises on culling information from a random list of financial data in Module 3. From Module 5, you will have to make no calculations, despite the fact that there's a set of lecture notes there on computing the APY, which is the annual percentage yield. You will not be required to compute the annual percentage yield from Module 5. From Module 6, you will be required to compute the monthly payments for an add-on loan. This requires no explanation because I know you know how to do it because you had to do it for project number 2. If you have a question on how to do this, post the question on the discussion board under test number 2, and I'll be delighted to explain that to you. Computing the APR for an add-on loan would require your use of the N ratio formula. I will provide you with the N ratio formula on the test, so you will not have to use any space on your cheat sheet for the N ratio formula. And finally, in computing the monthly payments for a declining balance loan, you will need to use the present value of an annuity formula, where the present value of an annuity is the payment times the present value interest factor of an annuity for whatever the percentage is, and the terms of the loan expressed in years. Now, the present value, that would be the amount of the loan, or the principal, the percentage that I will give you will be in a whole number so that you can use the tables that you copied from the back of the book or that you downloaded from the internet. The tables would, of course, have these coefficients. You naturally would want to use the coefficients from the table on the present value of an annuity, and I'll give you the terms of the loan in years. Then you would solve for the payment. Now this payment here would be annualized, so in order to convert that into monthly payments, you would simply take the payment which you had computed and divide it by 12, and this would give you the monthly payments for a declining balance loan. For Module 7, you'll need to be able to compute how much of a car you can afford. Now there is a sample problem there in the lecture notes from Module 7 entitled, How Much Car Can You Afford? This is a PDF file that demonstrates the way to compute how much car you can afford if the finance charges are calculated using the declining balance method, or if the finance charges are calculated using the add-on method. The key is to compute the amount you can afford to finance, less maintenance, and then once you compute the amount that you can afford to finance, you add back in the trade-in value of your car and the amount of the down payment. So this is illustrated there in that set of lecture notes. If you have a question about that, be sure to post them to the discussion board and I'll be all over it. You will also need to determine whether to select the low dealership financing or factory rebate if given such an option. If you go to the discussion board and look at the forum entitled Quiz 2, you will see there a sample problem illustrating the process of determining the low dealership financing or the factory rebate. The key is to compute the effective APR of the low dealership financing. Now, the dealership will give you the appropriate and true APR that is required by the Truth in Lending Law. However, you will want to use the foregone rebate, which is an implicit cost, as part of the finance charges to compute the effective APR. Then you take the effective APR of the low dealership financing, you compare that to the APR from your credit union when you accept the factory rebate, and the guy with the lowest APR is the option that you should take. How much house you can afford. An example of this is illustrated in Module 7 in the set of lecture notes entitled, surprisingly enough, How Much House Can I Afford? And then on the question of when to refinance, once again, if you go to the discussion board, the Quiz 2 forum, you will find a sample problem there that indicates when you should refinance. One last issue here. A few moments ago, when I was discussing how much car you can afford, I mentioned that you subtract the maintenance from the amount of car that you can finance. That's incorrect. You subtract maintenance from the amount that you have budgeted, and that will give you the amount that you can finance. Once again, this issue is illustrated in the problem, how much car can you afford, in the lecture notes in Module 7. So, there you go. The calculations you will need for test number 2. Now you have no excuse whatsoever for getting any of those questions wrong. But keep in mind there's a lot of other material as well, all of which is covered in the study guide. So if you have a question between now and test time, make sure that you post them on the discussion board. I have nothing else to do between now and then except to answer your questions. So I'll be all over that thing. Get back to you immediately. Sounds like you're going to have a good weekend. You can thank me later.